The Gulf Injustice Podcast, the official podcast of Detained in Dubai with Radha Stirling.
Now, Scott, who was held in jail in Iraq over a debt conviction in Qatar, has been freed. 43-year-old Brian Glendinning from Kincardine didn't know he was on an Interpol wanted list until he was detained in Basra. His family had been lobbying the UK government to help get him released. His brother John says conditions in the jail were horrendous.
The conditions have been vile. Brian was held in a holding cell that there was up to, I think in the end they said 44 people. This was a mixture of terrorists, drug dealers, people who had murdered their own father and openly speaking about using a shotgun on their own father. And there's Brian Glendinning, never missed a day of school.
Well, Mr. Glendinning was freed. He's now going to be arriving back in the UK. It's expected in the next few days. And it came after the authorities in Qatar said they no longer wanted him extradited. I'm joined now by Radha Stirling, who's the CEO of Detained in Dubai, who's been campaigning for his release. Radha, what do you think brought this about in the end?
I mean, it was a combination of factors. Firstly, an Iraqi lawyer was hired to negotiate as much as possible with authorities in Iraq. But I think, secondly, it was the campaigning that ultimately, the media campaigning, the international spotlight, that led to the British government being inspired enough to open diplomatic channels. But we also had to negotiate with Qatar National Bank, who are the ones who issued the Interpol Red Notice. And we actually settled with them because we had an anonymous donor that came forward after the press campaign to assist with that debt. So we were able to negotiate and settle with them. They then gave us a police clearance certificate stamped by the authorities in Qatar, which usually would take at least 3 weeks. But they were, because the spotlight was on, they didn't want to have all of this dramas, right around World Cup time as well. So we gave that to the Iraq authorities via the lawyer. But we also had Douglas Chapman MP, who actually went and met with the Qatar ambassador in London and asked him to get involved. And we also had conversations ourselves with the British ambassador in Qatar and asked, we had push from just every direction. And finally, Iraq and Qatar actually communicated, and Qatar said, OK, we don't really want to extradite him anymore. So at that point, Iraq said, OK, we will release you from prison. Now, at the moment, he's staying in a hotel. He's waiting his exit visa, and then he's going to get on the first flight out of there. But there's still a risk that he could be rearrested en route back to Scotland because we have no confirmation that the Interpol Red Notice has actually been removed yet. So I don't think the family is going to be completely relaxed until he touches down in Scotland.
So how is he? Because as described by his brother, their conditions in the jail in Iraq sounded terrible.
I mean, he's had trouble sleeping. He's been, non-stop communicating with his family. I think he was up in the middle of the night talking to his mother. It's just quite overwhelming. And of course, he's elated to finally be released. He thought that he was facing 2 years in a Qatari jail, or at least 1 year in Iraq as he fought the extradition proceedings. So it's sort of, a welcome shock that he was released. But I think in cases like this, that you get that initial excitement, and then the sort of PTSD element of what he's been through sinks in after a few days of being outside the prison. So he's been, struggling in prison. He's only been having bread. He couldn't eat the food. So he's finally getting some good dinner into him. So it's just now a question of, when's he going to touch down in Scotland?
And you do have wider concerns, don't you, about this Interpol wanted system?
Absolutely. I mean, Brian is not the first British national to be arrested abroad and have, detained in a foreign jail. We've had people, we had Robert Owen, he was stuck in a Ukrainian prison for up to a year before finally the extradition was denied. We've had multiple British nationals arrested in Spain, one in Prague, and they've had to go through this awful, horrendous process. It's costly. It's, they're behind bars. The family is freaking out that they're going to be extradited. And, of course, they're suffering in detention at that time. So this is a regular occurrence. We've even had people pulled out of their cars in Britain, in Cornwall, over a consumer debt of, £10,000 in a Middle Eastern country. It's a complete abuse of the Interpol process.
And do you have wider fears about people travelling to Qatar for the World Cup?
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's extreme concerns for anyone going to the UAE or Qatar for these events. We always receive telephone calls from people who are perhaps wrongfully arrested, detained, and even prosecuted and jailed. You only have to look 2 years ago when Connor Howard was arrested over carrying a herb grinder that had never been used. So anything can really set them off, and you're really at risk of arbitrary arrest and wrongful prosecution.
Radha, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us this lunchtime. That's Radha Stirling there from Detained in Dubai.
Thank you for listening to the Gulf Injustice podcast.